20 years ago, he walked away from her, left her in the dark with a secret she'd bury. Until tonight. Under the gala lights, a millionaire CEO hears 4 words that stop his heart. Meet your twin daughters. Who are they? Why now? This isn't just his story. It's a mystery unraveling love, betrayal, and the chance to fix what he broke. Stay with me. You won't believe where this ends. That's just the spark. 8 chapters of this wild ride are waiting for you right here. Want to see if he gets his second chance? Hit subscribe and that bell so you don't miss a twist. I'm dropping it all on this channel. Tell me in the comments, what's the biggest secret you've ever uncovered? Let's unpack this together. The Plaza Hotel shimmered like a jewel against the Manhattan skyline, its chandeliers casting a golden glow over the gala attendees below. Nathaniel Nate Carver stood at the edge of the ballroom, a glass of bourbon in hand, his tailored tuxedo hugging his broad shoulders as if it could mask the weariness in his soul. At 52, he was a man who had everything: money, power, a penthouse overlooking Central Park. And yet, tonight, he felt like a stranger in his own life. The divorce papers from his second wife, signed just 3 months ago, still lingered in his mind like a bitter aftertaste. He'd built an empire at Carver Financial, but the higher he climbed, the emptier the view became. The gala was his idea, a grand gesture to burnish his reputation after the tabloids had feasted on his latest personal failure. New York's philanthropic titan hosts Night of Giving, the headlines would read tomorrow. He donated $1 million to a vague cause, something about children he couldn't quite recall, and instructed his assistant to make it the event of the season. The room buzzed with the city's elite, CEOs in crisp suits, socialites dripping in diamonds, their laughter a symphony of privilege. Nate scanned the crowd, his hazel eyes sharp and restless, until they landed on a name on the guest list pinned to the wall. Eleanor Grayson, Grayson Hope Foundation. His breath caught, a jolt of memory slicing through the bourbon haze. Eleanor, his first wife, the one he'd walked away from 20 years ago, when ambition had been his only lover. He hadn't seen her since their divorce, hadn't wanted to, but there she was, a whisper from the past, stepping into his glittering present. She'd founded a small charity, he'd heard, something quaint, probably underfunded. A flicker of spite curled in his chest. Tonight he'd show her what success really looked like. He'd make her feel the weight of everything he'd become without her. Ladies and gentlemen, the MC's voice boomed over the speakers, pulling Nate from his reverie. Let's welcome our keynote speaker, Eleanor Grayson, whose foundation has transformed lives across this city with quiet grace. Quiet grace. Nate smirked, sipping his drink. He leaned against a marble pillar as Eleanor stepped onto the stage, and for a moment, the room seemed to hush. Not out of reverence, he told himself, but because she was a curiosity. She wore a simple navy dress, elegant but unpretentious, her auburn hair streaked with silver and swept into a loose bun. At 50, she carried an air of calm strength, her green eyes bright with a warmth he didn't remember. She was still beautiful, he admitted grudgingly, but it was a beauty that didn't need to shout. Thank you all for being here, Eleanor began, her voice steady and clear, cutting through the murmur of the crowd. The Grayson Hope Foundation exists because of one truth: kindness can light up the darkest corners. Tonight we honor the children who found homes, the families who found hope, all thanks to people like you. The applause was polite but tepid, and Nate seized his moment. He raised his hand, signaling the MC, who nodded eagerly. Before we move on, Nate said, stepping forward, his voice smooth as velvet, I'd like to announce Carver Financial's contribution, $1 million to support this noble cause. He paused, letting the number hang in the air, watching for Eleanor's reaction. A little light goes a long way, doesn't it? The room erupted in cheers, cameras flashing, but Eleanor didn't flinch. She met his gaze across the sea of faces, her lips curving into a faint, knowing smile. It wasn't gratitude or awe, as he'd expected. It was something softer, something that made his chest tighten. She inclined her head, a silent acknowledgement, then turned back to the crowd as if his grand gesture were just another ripple in her evening. Irritation flared in him. He'd wanted to see her shrink, to feel the gap between their worlds. But she stood there, unshaken, her presence a quiet rebuke to his noise. The gala swirled on, champagne flutes clinking, deals whispered in corners. But Nate couldn't shake her from his mind. He downed the rest of his bourbon, the burn doing little to settle the unease creeping up his spine. It wasn't until an hour later, as the event wound down, that the real shock came. Nate lingered near the bar, debating another drink when Eleanor approached, flanked by two young women, no, girls, barely out of their teens. They were striking, golden hair, sharp cheekbones, and eyes that mirrored his own hazel shade. Twins, he realized, his mind racing to place them. "Nate," Eleanor said, her voice gentle but firm, stopping him cold. "I'd like you to meet Lily and Rose, our daughters." The words hit him like a freight train. The glass slipped in his hand, nearly tumbling to the floor before he caught it. "Our... what?" His voice was a rasp, barely audible over the fading music. "Lily and Rose," she repeated, resting a hand on each girl's shoulder. "They're 18 now. I didn't tell you back then because you were building your world and I didn't want them caught in it. But they're here, and they deserve to know you if you want that." Lily, the taller one, gave a hesitant wave, her smile shy but curious. Rose, clutching a small sketchbook, studied him with an intensity that made his skin prickle. They were his daughters. The evidence was in their faces, in the way Lily's brow furrowed just like his, in the spark of Rose's gaze he'd seen in old photos of himself. Nate faltered, words dissolving into a tangle of disbelief and guilt. He looked at Eleanor, searching for anger, for accusation, but found only that same quiet grace she'd carried on stage. "Why now?" he managed at last. "Because they asked," she said simply. "And because I believe people can change. Even you, Nate." Before he could respond, she turned, guiding the girls toward the exit. "Think about it," she called over her shoulder, her silhouette vanishing into the crowd. The ballroom spun around him, the glittering lights blurring into a haze. He'd come here to prove his triumph, to bury the past under $1 million check. But instead, the past had walked in and called him Dad. Nate sank onto a velvet chair, the weight of the night pressing down on him. He'd spent 20 years chasing power, convinced it was the only light that mattered. But now, staring at the spot where Eleanor and their daughters had stood, he wondered if he'd been chasing shadows all along. The gala glittered on, oblivious to the man unraveling in its midst, but for Nate Carver, the real story was just beginning. The hum of the gala faded into a distant echo as Nathaniel Nate Carver stumbled out of the Plaza Hotel into the crisp March night. The Manhattan air bit at his cheeks, but it couldn't shake the heat rising in his chest, a cocktail of shock, anger, and something he couldn't name. He waved off his driver, needing the walk to clear his head, though the streets of Midtown offered no solace. The city's lights blinked like 1,000 accusing eyes, reflecting off the wet pavement from an earlier rain. Eleanor's words looped in his mind. "Our daughters. They deserve to know you, if you want that." He stopped at a corner near Fifth Avenue, leaning against a lamppost, its faint glow casting long shadows around him. Daughters, twins, 18 years old. The math checked out, a cruel arithmetic he hadn't dared to calculate until now. 20 years ago, he'd left Eleanor in their cramped Brooklyn apartment, a suitcase in hand and a head full of dreams about Wall Street. She'd begged him to stay, not with words, but with those green eyes that always saw through him. He'd ignored her, convinced love was a luxury he couldn't afford, not when success was so close he could taste it. Had she known then? Had she stood there pregnant with his children while he walked out the door? Nate's hands clenched into fists, his nails digging into his palms. He wanted to be furious, at Eleanor for keeping this secret, at himself for being blind to it. But the anger wouldn't hold. It slipped away like sand, leaving a hollow ache in its place. He pulled out his phone, tempted to call her, to demand answers. But what would he say? "Why didn't you tell me?" The question felt flimsy against the weight of 2 decades. Instead, he scrolled through his contacts until he landed on Tom Hargrove, his oldest friend, and the only person who'd known him before the suits and the skyscrapers. Tom answered on the second ring, his gravelly voice a comfort Nate hadn't realized he needed. "Nate, it's past midnight, man. You okay?" "No," Nate said, the words spilling out before he could stop it. "I just found out I have daughters, twins, with Eleanor." There was a long pause, then a low whistle. "Jesus, Nate, how'd this happen?" "She told me tonight, at the gala. Brought them right up to me. Lily and Rose, she called them." "They've got my eyes, Tom. My damn eyes." His voice cracked, and he hated how raw it sounded. Tom didn't miss a beat. "Meet me at O'Malley's. You need a drink and a friend, not a phone call." 20 minutes later, Nate slid into a worn booth at O'Malley's pub, a dive bar. They'd frequented in their 20s. Tom sat across from him, gray hair thinning but his broad frame still solid from years coaching high school football. The bartender slid 2 whiskeys across the counter without a word, and Nate took a sip, letting the burn steady him. "Start from the beginning," Tom said, his blue eyes steady. "What did Eleanor say?" Nate recounted the night, the gala, his $1 million flex, Eleanor's unshaken grace, and the bombshell of Lily and Rose. Tom listened, nursing his drink, until Nate finished with a shaky breath. "I don't get it, Tom. Why hide them? Why now?" Tom leaned back, rubbing his jaw. "You ever think she was protecting them? You weren't exactly Mr. Stability back then. Hell, you barely are now." The words stung, but Nate couldn't argue. At 32, he'd been a whirlwind, chasing deals, burning bridges, leaving Eleanor behind without a backward glance. "I didn't know," he muttered. "She should have told me." "Maybe she tried," Tom said quietly. "You weren't big on listening, Nate. Remember that fight you told me about? The one where she asked you to stay and you called her a dreamer holding you back?" Nate froze, the memory crashing over him like a wave. It had been late, rain tapping against the windows of their apartment. Eleanor had stood in the doorway, her voice trembling. "We could make this work, Nate. Together." He'd laughed, and told her he wasn't built for small dreams. He'd left that night, suitcase banging against the stairs, and never called. The next week he'd signed the divorce papers her lawyer sent, assuming she'd moved on. She hadn't chased him, hadn't fought. Now he wondered if she'd been fighting for something else entirely. "Shit," he whispered, running a hand through his dark hair now flecked with gray. "What if she was pregnant then, and I just left?" Tom shrugged, but his eyes softened. "You can't change that now. Question is, what are you gonna do about it?" "I don't know." Nate stared into his glass, the amber liquid swirling like his thoughts. "They're strangers, Tom. 18 years and I don't even know their birthdays." "Then start there," Tom said, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "You've spent your life building walls, money, power, all that crap. Maybe it's time to build something else." The bar's jukebox kicked on, some old Springsteen song about redemption and highways, and Nate let the music wash over him. He thought of Lily's shy wave, Rose's piercing stare, and Eleanor's calm certainty. She'd said she believed people could change, even him. Did he believe it? He'd spent so long running from the man he used to be. He wasn't sure who he was anymore. "Another round?" Tom asked, but Nate shook his head. "I need to think," he said, sliding out of the booth. "Thanks, Tom, for listening." "Anytime," Tom replied, raising his glass. "Just don't screw this up, Carver. You've got a shot most guys don't get." Outside, the city was quieter now, the streets slick with a fresh drizzle. Nate walked toward Central Park, the lampposts lining his path like sentinels. He stopped at a bench overlooking the reservoir, the water a dark mirror under the cloudy sky. His mind churned with questions. Why had Eleanor kept this from him? Had she hated him that much, or loved him enough to let him go? And those girls, his girls, what did they think of the father who'd never been there? He pulled his coat tighter, the damp air seeping into his bones. For years he'd measured his worth in dollars and headlines, but tonight, that yardstick felt useless. The truth was a shadow he couldn't outrun, and for the first time in decades, Nate didn't want to. He thought of Eleanor's smile, the way it hadn't wavered under his bravado, and a flicker of something stirred in him. Hope, maybe, or the ghost of a man he'd buried long ago. As the rain picked up, drumming a soft rhythm on the bench, Nate made a decision. He didn't know how to be a father or how to face Eleanor after all this time, but he'd find her. He'd ask the questions burning in his gut. And maybe, just maybe, he'd find a way to step out of the shadows and into whatever light she'd kept burning all these years. The sun hung low over Central Park the next afternoon, painting the reservoir in hues of gold and amber. Nathaniel Nate Carver sat on the same bench he'd collapsed onto the night before, his tie loosened and his suit jacket slung over one arm. Sleep had eluded him, the hours after O'Malley's pub swallowed by restless pacing in his penthouse. Every creak of the hardwood floor had mocked him with echoes of Eleanor's voice. They deserve to know you if you want that. Now in the daylight, the city felt less menacing, but the weight of her words pressed harder. He'd found her address through a quick call to his assistant, a modest brownstone in Brooklyn Heights, not far from where they'd once lived together. The Grace and Hope Foundation's website listed a weekend event at the park, a cleanup day for volunteers and the kids they served. Nate didn't know what he'd say, or if he'd even have the guts to face her, but sitting still wasn't an option. He needed to see Eleanor, to see Lily and Rose, to understand the life he'd missed. So here he was, staring at the water, rehearsing lines that sounded hollow even in his head. A chorus of laughter snapped him out of his thoughts. Across the path, a group of volunteers in bright orange vests hauled trash bags toward a dumpster, their chatter mingling with the rustle of leaves. Nate spotted Eleanor among them, her auburn hair tied back with a scarf, her sleeves rolled up as she handed a water bottle to a boy no older than 10. She moved with a quiet ease, her smile warm and unforced, and for a moment, Nate saw the woman he'd fallen for all those years ago, the one who danced with him in their tiny kitchen to a crackling radio. He stood, brushing off his slacks, and took a tentative step toward her. Then he saw them, Lily and Rose, emerging from behind a cluster of trees. Lily carried a rake, her golden hair catching the sunlight, while Rose balanced a stack of flyers, her sketchbook tucked under one arm. They were so alike yet so different. Lily's movements quick and purposeful, Rose's slower, more deliberate. Nate's heart thudded against his ribs. They were his daughters, and he was a stranger about to interrupt their world. Eleanor noticed him first. Her eyes widened briefly, then softened as she straightened, brushing dirt from her hands. "Nate," she said, her voice carrying over the breeze. "I didn't expect you here." "I didn't expect me either," he admitted, shoving his hands into his pockets to hide their tremble. "Can we talk?" She glanced at the girls who'd paused to watch, then nodded. "Give me a minute." She turned to the boy beside her. "Jamal, can you take these bottles to the recycling bin?" The kid beamed and scampered off, leaving Eleanor to close the distance between them. Up close, she looked tired but resolute, faint lines etched around her eyes from years Nate hadn't witnessed. "What's on your mind?" she asked, folding her arms. "Everything," he said, the word slipping out too fast. He took a breath, steadying himself. "Last night, you dropped a bomb on me, Eleanor. I've been up all night trying to figure out why you never told me about them." Her gaze held his, unflinching. "I wanted to, Nate. That night you left, I almost ran after you. But you were so sure of what you wanted. Your career, your big life. I was scared you'd see them as a burden, not a gift." The honesty cut, deeper than he'd expected. "I wouldn't have," he started, then stopped. Wouldn't he? Back then he'd been a man possessed, chasing deals and drowning in ego. He'd barely had room for Eleanor, let alone 2 babies. "Maybe you're right," he conceded, his voice low. "But I deserve to know." "Did you?" she countered, not unkindly. "You signed the divorce papers without a call, Nate. You moved on. I had to make a choice. Raise them in peace or drag them into a fight I wasn't sure you'd join." He winced, the truth of her words a mirror he couldn't look away from. "And now? Why bring them to me now?" Because they asked, she said, echoing her words from the gala. They've known about you for a while. Pictures, stories. Lily found an old article about you in the library last year. She's curious. Rose, she's harder to read, but she's here. They wanted to see you for themselves. Nate's throat tightened as he glanced at the girls, now just yards away, pretending not to eavesdrop. What do they know about me? That you're their father, Eleanor said simply. That you built something big. I didn't sugarcoat it, but I didn't make you a villain either. The rest is up to you. Before he could respond, Lily approached, her rake propped against her shoulder like a soldier's rifle. You're really him? She asked, her tone a mix of skepticism and wonder. The guy from the magazines? Nate managed a shaky smile. Yeah, I guess I am. I'm Nate. You're Lily? She nodded, studying him with those hazel eyes, his eyes. Mom says you're good with numbers. I'm terrible at math. Think that's your fault? The question caught him off guard, and he laughed, a rusty sound that felt foreign in his throat. Maybe. I'll take the blame if you want. Rose joined them, quieter, her sketchbook clutched to her chest. I don't care about math, she said, her voice soft but firm. Do you like art? I used to, Nate said, grasping for a memory. I drew a little in school, nothing special. She's amazing, Lily interjected, nudging her sister. Show him, Rose. Rose hesitated, then flipped open her sketchbook to a pencil drawing of the reservoir, its ripples captured with a precision that stole Nate's breath. It's beautiful, he said, meaning it. You've got real talent. She shrugged, but a faint blush crept up her cheeks. Thanks. Eleanor watched the exchange, her expression unreadable, then clapped her hands. Girls, why don't you grab some water? I'll catch up in a sec. They obeyed, though Lily shot Nate a lingering look before heading off. Alone again, Eleanor turned to him. They're good kids, Nate, but they're not kids anymore. They're figuring out who they are. If you want to be part of that, you've got to earn it. No shortcuts. How? He asked, the question raw and desperate. I don't even know where to start. Start by showing up, she said, her voice softening. Be here, not just for them, but for yourself. Figure out what you want this to mean. He nodded, the simplicity of her advice both daunting and grounding. Can I come back next weekend, maybe? If you're serious, she said, then smiled, a real one, small but bright. We'll be here, same time, same place. As she walked away to rejoin the group, Nate sank back onto the bench, the lake stretching out before him like a quiet promise. He'd come expecting a confrontation, maybe even a rejection, but instead, he'd found a tentative bridge. Fragile, but there, Lily's teasing, Rose's art, Eleanor's steady faith in second chances. They were threads of a life he'd never imagined, tugging at the edges of his armored heart. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the water, and Nate felt a shift, subtle but real. He didn't have answers, didn't know how to be a father or mend what he'd broken. But for the first time in years, he wanted to try. The lake whispered its quiet call, and as the volunteers' laughter faded into the dusk, Nate Carver decided he'd answer it, one step, one day at a time. The sky over Brooklyn Heights was a brooding gray the following Saturday, the kind of day that promised rain, but held back just long enough to tease. Nathaniel Nate Carver adjusted the collar of his overcoat as he stepped out of his car, a sleek black sedan that looked out of place on the tree-lined street. He'd swapped his usual suit for a sweater and jeans. Casual, he hoped, though the mirror had mocked him as a man trying too hard. The brownstone across the road belonged to Eleanor, its brick facade weathered but welcoming, a stark contrast to the glass and steel fortress of his penthouse. He'd spent the week wrestling with himself, replaying the park encounter in his mind like an old film reel. Lily's teasing jab about math, Rose's shy pride in her sketchbook, Eleanor's steady gaze. They haunted him, stirring a restless ache he couldn't bury under boardroom bravado. He'd called Tom twice, pacing his office while his friend dispensed gruff wisdom. Show up, Nate. That's half the battle.